It doesn't seem right.
Thank God.
In the Quran, mention is made of one particular category of people. In Arabic, these are
ما ملكت أيمانكم.
Ma malakat aymanukum. A Quranic term that is most commonly translated as, what your right hand possesses, and is widely understood as referring to slaves.
In 2 verses, the Quran mentions ma malakat aymanukum, which henceforth we will call MMA, in the context of exposing one's private parts in their presence. And they both read,
Amongst the righteous are those who guard their private parts, except from their spouses, or the MMA.
These are the verses that most Muslims presume gives a license for male Muslims to have sex with their female slaves. The rationale is that not guarding their private parts must be a euphemism for having sexual intercourse, and which seems to be allowed with 2 separate types of people, with spouses, as well as with slaves.
No doubt influenced by the realities of their time, where slavery and concubines were near universal. Classical Islamic jurists unanimously upheld the perceived divine right for male Muslims to have sex with their female slaves. And thus, a large body of fiqh, Islamic law, was created to regulate the practice, which served to further entrench and legitimize the practice within Islamic civilization.
As Islam spread from Arabia into new territory, there was a dramatic increase in the number of slaves taken into Muslim lands. By far the most widespread trade in slaves throughout Islamic history was in Africa. After conquering North Africa, Muslims set up a large network of slave trading routes, so that African slaves could be transported to the Muslim heartland and sold. These African trade routes quickly became the main source of slaves in the Muslim world. Over 12 centuries, an estimated 11 to 14 million slaves were traded via these routes, of which females outnumbered men by a ratio of around 2 to 1. Any one of whom could potentially be used for the sexual pleasure of their male masters.
For traditionalist Muslims, who hold the legal opinions of classical Islamic jurists as an article of faith, almost equal to the Quran itself. They find themselves in a tricky situation when they are asked to explain the morality of what is now universally considered an immoral practice, namely keeping slaves for sex.
Oh, that's awkward.
Because, since their revered scholars and books of fiqh unanimously uphold the right of male Muslims to keep slaves for sex, these traditionalists would not dare oppose such authority,
and you will respect my authority,
which, remember, they consider as an article of faith, almost on par with the Quran itself.
Is consent necessary or not? Is rape allowed? No, it is absolutely not allowed. Consent was necessary for this woman that comes into the household in that way, even though she's a prisoner of war, even though she comes in as a quote-unquote concubine, which again is unheard of, her consent was absolutely necessary.
Right. Just so we're clear here. Soldiers march in, capture these terrified women by force, probably ripping them away from their families. Then, claim them as their rightful, sexual property. But somehow, these captives still have the ability to refuse their captors sexually.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Well, maybe it is stupid, but it's also dumb.
Well, let's at least give due credit that he actually managed to say all that BS with a straight face.
That's incredible.
Still, while the idea of consent in a master-slave sexual relationship may seem like a sick joke, let's at least consider the evidence he presents for this claim. And here, he quotes a ruling by one of the four great Sunni jurists, Imam al-Shafi, which says,
He said, rahimahullah ta'ala, if a man acquires a slave girl by force, and then he forces himself on her, Imam al-Shafi'i rahimahullah ta'ala said, number one, she's free. The woman goes free. Number two, uqima alayhi hadd zina. The punishment of adultery is applied to him, not her. And he must pay her something.
that's just wrong.
firstly, he misquotes al-Shafi on two significant points. Here is the actual quote, translated from the Arabic.
If a man acquires by force a slave girl, then has sexual intercourse with her after he acquires her by force, and if he is not excused by ignorance, then the slave girl will be taken from him, he is required to pay the fine, and he will receive the punishment for illegal sexual intercourse.
Firstly, according to the ruling, the slave is not freed after being raped, as claimed. She is merely taken from the rapist's possession. Secondly, the victim is not compensated financially, as claimed. The fine is paid to the slave's master, as compensation for damaged property. The other problem with this evidence is that it is taken completely out of context. the ruling was not talking about a master raping his slave, as was clearly implied. Rather, the ruling was made in the chapter on property rights. Specifically, what happens when a man takes and damages another man's rightful possession, in this case, his slave. Thus, the ruling is concerned only for the property rights of the slave owner, and has nothing whatsoever to do with protecting any right of the slave girl to consent.
Not even close.
And the other interesting thing in this is that, POWs, you can do whatever you want, unthinkable things with them, and nobody can question you. But this is not the case with malakat aymanukum, what your right hands possess. They have rights. Practically, they enjoy everything a wife enjoys. The only difference is the term nikah.
If you became intimate with this woman, someone who was mulkamin, someone who came into the house as a captive, she now enjoys the privileges and the rights of a wife.
Here, the claim is made that the legal difference between a man's wife and his concubine is merely semantical, and that in practical terms, a man's concubine enjoyed the same rights as the wife. So,
Is it true?
No, it's not true. First, the obvious. A man obviously can't sell his wife, or marry her off to another man, as he can with his slave. But another big difference is in relation to consent. As already discussed, jurists don't give any consideration to a concubine's consent in relation to sex. However, this is not the case with regards to wives. Classical jurists considered and made rulings on situations in which a wife refuses sex with her husband, which in Islamic law is known as nushuz.
Look at my new shoes!
No, not nushuz, nushuz, an Arabic word that roughly translates as rebellion. And while jurists maintained that it was the wife's duty to always be available for her husband's sexual needs, the majority of them agreed that her consent was still required. But no such requirement for consent was ever considered for concubines.
Another way, in which the legal status of concubines is different to wives, is in regards to contraception. A majority of jurists agree that a man needs a wife's permission to practice contraception with her. However, does not need the same permission while having sex with his concubines.
I know it's a disturbing topic, and again, I want you to realize we're talking about 1400 years ago in the context of war. We're not talking about an ideal situation. We're talking about a solution that has to deal with a very ugly reality. And Islam is grounded in that reality and finding the ideal solution to ugly realities.
Allah Azza wa Jal legislated something that for the time and the context was the most humane possible.
Well, allow me to retort.
Sure, we get that it was a crappy situation, in a time when the practice was near universal. And of course, we acknowledge that some system had to be in place to deal with the unavoidable problem of receiving female captives in war. But can we really say that the solution devised by Islamic jurists was the most humane possible? Let's take a look at some details of the law.
One famous hadith graded as authentic gives an Islamic permission to tear wives away from their husbands, for the purpose of making these wives the sex slaves of their Muslim conquerors. The hadith describes a military campaign in which the Muslims are victorious, and female captives are taken. However, the Muslims were uncertain whether or not they could have sex with them, as the captives were still married. The hadith then claims that in order to resolve their dilemma, a Quranic verse was revealed that supposedly gave permission to take these married women as their sex slaves.
I don't understand. I don't understand, bitch. Don't understand. I don't understand, bitch.
You gotta be kidding me. You gotta be kidding me!
Contained within the Maliki Book of Fiqh is a section on istibra. Istibra is the Islamic term for the waiting period a slave master should observe before engaging in sexual intercourse with his slave. Disturbingly, in the ruling, there is an istibra specified for female child slaves, which tellingly is the same period as older women who no longer menstruate, thus indicating that this same period is specified because she also does not menstruate, because she is prepubescent. In a most horrific hadith from the Sahih Bukhari collection, Ali, one of the most trusted and revered companions, and future caliph, takes for himself one of the female captives and has sex with her. This angers another companion partly because he had not observed the appropriate istibra. However, even more disturbing than this account is the explanation of this hadith, given by renowned hadith commentator Ibn Hajar. Here Ibn Hajar addresses the istibra issue, and defends Ali with these words. The allegation was defensible, as she was a virgin and not pubescent, and thus she did not need to observe istibra, thus attesting to a ruling that allowed sex with prepubescent children, which apparently did not even require any waiting period. But then comes the real kicker. where he casually informs us that this practice was merely in accordance with the practice of many companions before him.
Consent was necessary.
It's just like wrong. This is wrong.
This hadith from Sahih Muslim describes the rather distasteful dilemma faced by some companions in whether or not they should practice coitus interruptus while having sex with some females they had just captured after a battle. Notice the language used to describe these women. Some excellent Arab women, whom the companions desired sexually. Keeping in mind we are talking about women who had just been captured by a conquering army. And one can only imagine the terror they were feeling as they were being thrust into this horrifying position as the sexual objects of their captors. What mental gymnastics must one go through to interpret this account as the most humane solution to a difficult situation?
This concludes part 1 of this two-part series. In part 2, we will look at what the solution is for Muslims. A solution that expunges this awful practice of sex slavery from the Islamic faith.
We must expunge them. We must redact them. They are a mistake that we shall now erase.
Look forward to seeing you then.
Thanks for watching.
Feel free to comment
and like and subscribe.